First, I want to pause and just say an interesting feature of Buddhism to me, very interesting feature, is that these doctrines, on the one hand, have a formal articulation and an intellectual rationale, but they are also often doctrines that you're supposed to be able to appreciate experientially through meditation, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
and so in this case, you know, we haven't used the word emptiness, but what we've been talking about has been related to a central concept, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, called emptiness. And there the idea is that things don't really have, you might say, a self-sufficient, substantial existence. They don't have essence, certainly. The sense of essence you get when you perceive things is misleading. And and that's why in Mahayana, just briefly, it's interesting that they see that as just an extension of the not self idea. It's like, I don't have an essence, the tree doesn't have an essence, the rock doesn't have an essence, and so on. But leaving that aside,
Yeah, so the way I see Vasubandhu's understanding of sort of the lack of essential nature of all things is that things don't exist the way that they seem to exist. So whatever idea that we have about things, it's always a limited partial perception, a partial conception, or it's based on our visual or sensory perspective. And it's constructed from a particular angle, so we have a certain kind of a body, we see things in a particular way. Things aren't really the way that our body perceives them. They're empty of that nature. And then we conceive of things in a certain way. We have certain mental capacities, we have certain kinds of language. We formulate ideas. Those ideas lead us to think that things have those ideas apply to realities, but actually whatever we have an idea of is just a causally constructed idea, just an appearance of a particular kind, a conceptual appearance in this case. Mm-hmm. So concepts, perceptions, whatever they are, they don't hold a reality in the way that we think that they do. That's what it means. So no matter what we're pointing our attention toward, it doesn't exist the way that it seems.
Right. It is useful to think of them as existing. Now, generally when you say this, people say, wait a second, do you mean to tell me that tree is not there? I mean, if I walk out there, I bump into it. And I guess what you might say, thinking about the radiation example, is like, you can imagine beings being designed that if radiation is sufficiently bad for them, that once they started perceiving it, they would feel as if they had run into a wall. They wouldn't be able to go further because going further would kill them. So they would have that feeling. Evolution might have designed an organism like that, but we walk right through it. And so it's, at the same time, yes, okay, the tree's kind of out there. But but the point is,
but the issue isn't that there isn't anything out there.
Right.
The issue is that we look out there and we think we know what we're seeing. We're seeing a solid object that has certain colors, a certain shape. But actually, we also know that, from molecular physics, we know that there's a lot of space between the molecules that make up that tree. But when you bump into it, it feels like it's a solid object. So we have learned to acknowledge in a kind of secondhand way. Yes, of course, things don't really exist the way that they seem. They have space in them even when they seem solid. Right. But what the Buddhist is saying is that we still haven't really fully internalized that.
Right. And they are also in constant exchange with their environment, and so today's tree is not tomorrow's tree, and so on.
Exactly. Right.
So just quickly on this meditation point, it is the case that meditating deeply, and I've talked to people who have been really serious adept meditators, and they go around living in a world that has this property of emptiness to some extent. They see things, and I would say feel things, as having less in the way of independent identity as maybe we do. It's not to say they don't see a lamp or they run into lamps. It's just they describe their visual field in a way that does sound a little different to me. And I was just going to ask you, do we know if Vasubandhu himself was much of a meditator? Again, his half-brother, the founder of Yogacara, was said to be quite some meditator. Does Vasubandhu ever talk about this?
I don't think that we can know about Vasubandhu, and it's not a major part of his biography. but he's a philosopher who's drawing upon practice traditions and texts that have been handed down by a whole range of people from multiple practice and also philosophical traditions. And so the doctrinal analysis, I don't think in Buddhism really is totally separate at any point from at least the inherited knowledge of people who are engaging in practice to some degree. The yogacara means practice of yoga, and in this tradition it meant so when Vasubandhu. So one of the things that's interesting is Vasubandhu is said to be one of the founders of Yogacara, and people refer to him as the Yogacara, great Yogacara teacher. But in his writing, the word Yogacara just means practice of meditation. Mm-hmm. And he refers to people, when you're doing a yogacara, this is what happens. The yogacharas say this, but they're not the advocates of yogacara as mind only or as appearance only. Those are people who do yoga. So during his time, that's what yogacara meant, and that's probably what the Yogacara Bhumi, the text that Asanga wrote to found the Yogacara school, meant. It's the stages of practice of yoga. In this case, in the Buddhist tradition, yoga was primarily seated meditation.
So, but it is reasonable to surmise that this school of thought was shaped by meditative apprehensions that people had and tried to make sense of.
It's certainly essential to these schools that they not contradict people's general concept of what is going on when you meditate, and that they allow for that and they account for that, and the practice traditions are wrapped up in the Buddha's teachings on how to practice and what you achieve when you achieve various states of practice are all part of the Abhidharma traditions and the Yogacara as well. The Yogacara Mahayana is based on scriptures that very often are describing states of mind, or at least they seem to come out of a particular. So the famous Heart Sutra has a description. It starts by saying, well, the great Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara saw the emptiness of the five aggregates, and then he ends up giving a teaching. Where he says there is no, but he saw it first. He was in a particular meditative state. First he sees it, and then he says there is, no form, no feeling, no ideas, no skandhas, no consciousness. So the idea is that samskaras,
form is emptiness is one of the famous lines in some translations.
Right, exactly. So the idea is that there's definitely a rhetoric of the connection to meditative experience, and I don't really see reason. Although I think in the modern world we assume probably a lot more meditation, advanced meditative practice was going on than probably has gone on historically, but because that's so central to basically every modern Buddhist practitioner in the West.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I think it's probably going too far to really put too much doubt on the idea that people were actually meditating. People were meditating at the very least because we have texts that say you really should be meditating. Yeah. Somebody's going to be doing it.
Well, it's also a fact that in the modern world, many people say, yes, through intensive meditation, I have a feeling for not self, and I have a feeling for emptiness. It
does
actually
seem like that, like you can do that, right?
Yeah.
You can cultivate that experience.
Yeah.
But of course, that is, there's a certain degree of sort of
could be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
People are very malleable,
right.
and you can shape your experience, I think, very intensively. People have all kinds of visions,
right,
and describe their experience, a whole range of experiences that are associated with, every religious tradition and every, and so we don't want to make the case. The scholar Bob Scharf makes this argument that people claim that they experienced alien abductions, and it's hard to explain why they all seem to have the same stories. But even if we claim that we can't explain it, and we don't really know, probably they weren't abducted by aliens, and probably they didn't experience those experiences at the time the way that we hear them describing it. But they're very sure, right? They're very certain that they did. At the very least, I'm probably being more tentative than I, actually feel here.
No, that's appropriate caution. I mean, I think there's a whole counter argument I could kind of make, but this is not the place to make it.
Right. I mean, I think that we need to be cautious about what we're claiming, and Vasubandhu doesn't ever say. It's certainly not the case that Vasubandhu or any of the other philosophers within his tradition, Buddhaghosa, for example, would say, as a similar sort of situation for the Theravada tradition. These are scholars who are working with texts and philosophy. They're not claiming that they know this because they experienced it.
Right. And
if they did experience it, they set that aside, right? It might be that they're inspired by an experience and then they go and study the philosophy. But in this case, they don't let on, right? And it's certainly not part of the authority of their knowledge.
And it might be that the experience was had by someone long ago, maybe the Buddha himself, and was put into a few sutras, and they were born in this tradition, and so they tried to make sense of it, and this is what they did.
Right, exactly.